My name is Emilia Claire Santos. I'm 39 years old, and I live in a cramped fourth-floor walk-up in the Gowanus neighborhood of Brooklyn. I keep my apartment half filled with books, a battered upright piano that I play when I can't sleep, and boxes of receipts and legal documents that are the nervous compulsions of someone who has always mistrusted how the world handles money. Right now, my life is quiet in a brittle way. Recently divorced, estranged from my younger brother, and newly unemployed at a company where I secretly held the controlling stake. That's the part of the story that gets to the center of why the office went silent, when my boss learned I was the real investor. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. If I start at the beginning of the end, it's because the beginning is braided with the rest. My mother working the night shift at a diner to keep us fed, my father gone long before I could shape a memory of him into anything but a blurred absence. The smell of coffee grounds and bleach on my mother's uniform is as embedded in me as my own heartbeat. I learned young that money could be both armor and a weapon. I learned to hide things, including the fact that 10 years ago, when my mother died and left me a small, ugly house in upstate New York and a life insurance check, I did something I never told anyone. I used most of that money to buy a stake in a company called Lenox Creative Solutions. Lenox was supposed to be a local, scrappy ad and design studio with more ambition than cash flow. Their offices were a glassy box on a quiet corner of Manhattan's garment district, scent of cold brew and printer toner, the hum of the HVAC like an unending commuter train. It had seemed like a good place to put my money. People who stayed up terrible hours and loved what they did. I liked that. I liked the idea that I could help people keep their jobs without stepping into the limelight to run the place. I stayed invisible for years, an anonymous investor whose name was tucked into a blind trust. I watched them from the sidelines, sitting in cheap chairs at community board meetings and at fundraisers, feeling strangely maternal toward a company that never knew me. The CEO, Marcus Hale, my boss, was a man with a loud laugh and a tendency to take credit loudly. He'd built the company from a basement office with 3 other idealists, and over the years his swagger had become indistinguishable from the company identity. The staff adored him. He had become their version of a father figure. For months, I was content watching him on stage at industry panels, watching the studio's Instagram glow with polished work, happy in the quiet satisfaction of having preserved something small and lovely. Then the summer 2 years ago, something shifted. Marcus started making bigger promises than the company could deliver. A rushed expansion, a handful of overambitious contracts, and a string of payroll delays that he swatted away with grand speeches about growth. He was charismatic, and charisma tends to be the best camouflage for desperation. The first time I felt the copper taste of panic in my mouth was when I received a letter marked urgent from Lennox's law firm. It was a pay or sue notice from an outside vendor. It was also the first time I realized anonymous investor meant silent witness. I could have stayed silent, kept my anonymity and let the company fight its way out or sink. But the more I read, the emails between Marcus and the CFO, the spreadsheets that didn't add up, the more that hollow in my chest widened. There were names on a payroll ledger I recognized as friends of mine, designers who had slept on couches because of late payments, interns who'd become parents. The sense of being a guardian crept in. I had a legal stake and I had a moral one. So I did the unthinkable. Called my lawyer. I covertly stepped in, funneling money in ways that would keep payroll current without publicly rescuing Marcus. I wanted him to be a hero, to rebuild his company without the stigma of having been saved. I wanted everyone to keep their dignity. For a year it worked. There were late nights, whispering to accountants, small deposits, quiet meetings in tiny cafes with people who thought I was just another client. I told myself I was doing the right thing. But secrets, especially the kind that involve money, have a way of souring. I miscalculated the depth of Marcus's pride. I didn't account for how much the idea of being in control meant to him. And I certainly didn't anticipate how a revelation would feel like a physical blow in a room already taut with tension. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I don't say that lightly. There are nights I replay every decision and ask if the quiet dignity I wanted was worth the chaos that followed. One late October morning, I walked into the office for a meeting I didn't expect to attend. There was a low drizzle outside that made the city smell like wet metal and warm pretzels, and when the elevator opened on Lennox's floor, I smelled paper, rubbed hands, and the metallic tang of printer ink. Ordinary, everyday things that suddenly felt like the calm before a storm. The bullpen was fuller than usual. There were faces lined with weariness, eyes that flashed up when Marcus entered. He was wearing a blazer that had seen better press conferences and a crooked tie. He laughed at something, then caught my eye. For a second his whole face rearranged. Curiosity, then calculation. I didn't yet know that the office would go silent for reasons that had nothing to do with acoustics and everything to do with truth. But I felt like a peripheral nerve waking, the first electric whisper that something was about to break. When Marcus called the staff into the conference room, the chatter dissolved as if someone had pulled a blanket over the room. The conference table was warm from coffee cups and the sun that filtered through half-closed blinds. I sat at the end, palms flat on the wood, feeling the grain press into my skin. My heartbeat had a steady, betraying rhythm. Everyone was there. Maya from accounts, Tom who designed logos, Lila who managed social. A projector hummed like an aircraft. Marcus stood at the head of the table, and his smile was tight in a way that made the sound of it brittle. "Okay, team," he said, voice pitched for camaraderie. "Changes are coming. We've got new investors, new contracts, and a structure we believe will help Lennox scale." He gestured to a slide. There were logos, an investor profile, one that, to my shock, listed a different name as majority stakeholder. A name I didn't recognize. Marcus's chest expanded with the performance of a man proud to announce a fresh miracle. It was then that a member of the legal team, Thomas Reed, a thin man with small bespectacled eyes, cleared his throat and said quietly, "We've had questions about the ownership structure. There's a transfer request pending that needs ratification." The room shifted like a crowd at a play when the plot suddenly turns dark. Conversations dwindled. Marcus's jaw worked. He moved to the table and opened a folder. The air tasted of stale coffee and metal. "Look," Marcus said, then swallowed. "There's been confusion. We've been operating under verbal agreements and emergency infusions for a while. We need to formalize. We need everyone aligned." It was then that Maya, the woman from accounts who always smelled faintly of jasmine, asked the question that felt like a closing door. "Who are the new backers? Who is the majority partner?" Marcus blinked. For a beat too long he didn't answer. The silence stretched. It felt like the moment between a train whistle and impact. Everyone knew it ought to be filled with motion, but none could predict its shape. Then Thomas slid a folder across the table. "We have documentation of a trustee arrangement. The trust names Amelia Claire Santos as the beneficial owner." The room turned in one small, synchronous motion to look at me. The sound of breath moving at once is one I will never forget. Soft, collective, like pages being turned in a book. My body flooded with heat, then cold, as if my blood had been called into the center of gravity and then pushed out again. "You!" Marcus's voice was empty, edged now with something like ire. "You, Amelia. You're the one who's been covering payroll." He said it like an accusation, not a question. I felt my mouth open and close without sound. My palms were slick on the table. There was the hum of the projector and then, the office went silent. I had banked on anonymity because I feared performance would change people. I feared that if Marcus knew, he'd either demand credit or crumble under its weight. I wanted the employees to keep their jobs and their belief that they were being saved by luck and talent, not by a shadowy benefactor's checkbook. But whatever reasoning, I had felt small and unmoored in that moment. Marcus's expression sharpened in ways I had rarely seen. The man who had given pep talks and cheered on late nights now looked like someone who'd been exposed standing in a doorway. There were too many things caught in his face at once. Relief, fear, resentment, and an ugly smallness that sat in his eyes like a bruise. "You never said." He began, then stopped. We both knew what he meant. "You never said because you wanted to control how I would be saved. You never said because you wanted the story to be about Marcus Hale, not Amelia Santos." My throat hitched. I tried to speak, to explain, to put into words the nights of worry, the clandestine transfers, the emails with accountants whose eyes were always on the next ledger. But Marcus, like a boxer broken by the sight of blood, was quick to jab. "You used my loyalty as currency," he said, voice low enough that only those closest could hear. "You kept us on a leash. You let me take the credit while you held the strings." The room felt smaller, planet-sized in its ability to hold the moment. Lila's hands were folded so tightly her knuckles were white. Tom's shoulders had curved forward as if protecting someone. Maya's face went chalky. Even Thomas looked as if the air had thickened. At home, in the careful dim of my apartment, I'd pictured a different reaction. Gratitude, relief. In my mind I had been some kind of clandestine benefactor who let heroes be heroes. Instead, the revelation read like an exposure, a betrayal. The silence, when a room full of vocal, creative people all stopped breathing at once, was not peaceful. It was charged, a static electric field waiting for a spark. "You should have told me," Marcus said, quieter, the accusation curdling into something vulnerable. "We could have made better decisions together. I thought I was steering the ship." The warmth I'd brought to the company to keep it afloat went suddenly cold. "You were steering," I said, because I could not bear the idea that he had not tried, had not burned himself up to save the thing he loved. "I just didn't want to change the story." He laughed then, a short, bitter sound. "You didn't want me to have the story. You wanted to own the outcome." It was in that instant that two continents of feeling collided. His need to be the architect, my need to be the unseen support. The staff looked between us like children in a household argument that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with where they would sleep, what would be on their table. A small murmur began, then stopped as if a hand had slapped it away. The office went silent again, but this time the quiet was not simply the absence of sound. It was the absence of certainty. It was the moment when a family argument becomes public, when you learn the skeleton in the closet belongs not to a stranger but to the very person whose name you say at the holiday table. If this feels familiar, if you've ever had to choose between revealing a painful truth and protecting someone's pride, please leave a comment. Has something like this ever happened to you? I read everything. The silence stretched, and in that gap, I knew our story was no longer mine to shape alone. After the meeting, the room emptied in a shuffled, awkward way. People lingered by desks, fingers tracing the edges of keyboards as if the tactile world might anchor them. Some stayed late that evening, ostensibly to finish projects. Really, it was avoidance. Marcus retreated to his office with Thomas and the board attorney. I sat in the empty conference room with a cup of now cold coffee and the knowledge that anonymity had been a brittle shelter. The following days were a slow erosion. The press wanted statements. The board wanted clarity. There were emails with subject lines that read like verdicts. Ownership clarification, immediate action required, potential litigation exposure. The staff split, mostly in quiet, private ways. A flurry of hushed conversations in the kitchen, a flinty tension in Slack messages. People looked at me differently. Some with gratitude that felt like pity, some with suspicion, as if my hand on the ledger meant I had been the puppeteer in a play they had been living. But the real fallout was not corporate. It was in the personal fissures that opened and spread underweight. My brother Manuel, who still lived in our tiny hometown upstate, called me. He had been among the first to know I'd inherited the house and some savings, and over the years we had a tacit agreement about not asking how each other handled money. He was the kind of man whose temper was a quick temper with a soft heart. He once poked a hole in a wall with his fist to make me laugh when we were kids. "Why didn't you tell Marcus?" he demanded over the phone, voice tight with more than just curiosity. "You could have just helped openly. Now people are hurt and angry. You dragged them into this." "No," I said, because the truth was a tangled vine. "I wanted them to have dignity. I wanted Marcus to run the ship." "Or you wanted to run it from the dark," Manuel said. There was a pause, and I could hear rain in the background of his line, a monotone sound that made me feel small and far. "You always loved that, AM. Control." The word landed like a thrown thing. Control. He hit an old nerve, a childhood memory of my mother arranging lunches, of labeling jars of coins, of me cataloging receipts like prayer beads. Control had been my armor. I had thought it was compassion. The board convened. Lawyers came and went like tides. There were options on the table: full disclosure and restructuring, buyouts, a mediated plan for governance. Marcus proposed a vote of confidence, not in himself, but in the board, which felt like a maneuver to regain narrative control. I proposed oversight and accountability, public audits, an external CFO, transparent payroll processes. My recommendations sounded clinical on paper and necessary to me in the marrow. But they also smelled of accusation to Marcus. One evening, barely a week after the first meeting, he knocked on my apartment door. I remember the sound of the buzzer, the way the building's hallway smelled faintly of soap and wet coats. I opened the door to find him smaller than I'd expected. His hair flattened, a scarf bunched at his throat like an afterthought. "Can I come in?" he asked. He looked exhausted and a little frightened. I let him in. My apartment was a map of my life. Unpaid bills stacked with piano sheets, a mug on the windowsill, the city muffled below. He took my couch like a man who'd been living on adrenaline and had suddenly been asked to sit down. "Amelia," he said, "I don't know where to start." "You can start with the truth," I said. "Or what you think it is." He laughed hollowly. "You think I don't know the truth? I know enough. I know someone's been keeping us afloat while I gave speeches and made decisions. I know people were paid because someone pushed cash behind the scenes. I know you did that." "I did," I said, "because I wanted to be an honest actor in this drama, not a hidden one." I told him how much I'd put in, how I routed funds, why I had done it. I explained the trust, the reasoning about dignity. My voice trembled. Some of it from the pressure of admitting, some of it from the relief of finally turning the engine over for someone else to see. He listened, fingers drumming on the coffee table wood. At one point he put his head in his hands, and for a beat I thought he might weep. Instead he said quietly, "You saved them. You saved people I care about. You also made me small." We argued then, not loud but sharp, like two people scraping the tenderness off each other. "You had no right," he said. "You undermined me. You thought you knew better. You asked for help, Marcus. You signed emails asking for time extensions. You accepted returns without asking. I did what I could to keep the lights on. And you did it in a way that made betrayal inevitable," he said. His voice was raw. "You kept secrets from the people you want to protect. You didn't trust them with the truth." This was the wound I'd never been able to name. The difference between protection and paternalism, between helping and deciding for others. My hands shook. I felt like a student being called out by a stern teacher who loved me but knew my methods were dangerous. Outside, the city buzzed on, indifferent. The radiator clanked like a heart under strain. Marcus stood up then, smoothing his jacket like armor. "We need to propose a plan to the board," he said. "We need to be transparent. For everyone's sake. And if the board wants you gone." Yes. The words were a low, honest fear. He looked at me then, softer than I'd seen him. "I don't know. But I do know this. If I go, it's not because you're revealed. It's because we were not honest with each other." The legal avenues opened like a canyon. Employees whispered potential lawsuits, and a few sent messages thanking me for saving their bills while also expressing betrayal that they had been kept in the dark. The tension was like a weight. Sometimes I could carry it, sometimes it felt like gravity itself. If you're still following, and if this part is touching something in you, please hit the like button. It helps tell me I'm not talking to myself into the dark. Also, if you've ever had to walk the tightrope between helping and controlling, I'd love to hear your story below. I read every single comment. We all had to reckon with the small, ugly truth. Good intentions don't excuse secrecy. The board opted for transparency. A public statement was drafted, then redrafted. We agreed to bring in an outside auditor. The employees would be told the truth in a town hall meeting. Marcus and I were to present it together. The day of the town hall, The conference room filled again. People came in with lunch bags, with the expression of those who know their lives might shift. The projector hummed. My palms were clammy. Marcus and I stood at the front, two people who had been allies and adversaries in a war of our own making. The office hummed, ridiculous and human and waiting for a verdict. There was a taste of iron in my mouth, as if the earlier silence had embedded itself into me, making everything metallic. The town hall was scheduled for noon on a Tuesday, which meant the city had both the lethargy of the workweek and the urgency of deadlines just beyond. People filed in, some with earbuds still in, others whispering in groups. The projector cast the company logo, Lennox Creative Solutions, on the whiteboard. It looked smaller than it had on every job listing slide, reduced now to text on a screen that could no longer hide cracks. Marcus spoke first. He recited facts with a voice that was steady, purposeful. He acknowledged the payroll delays, the rushed decisions, then steered his words carefully toward ownership disclosure. In the past months, he said, we learned of a trust arrangement and a benefactor who has been providing emergency funding to keep us operating. He named me. The room shifted again, but differently now. There was less accusation and more a flurry of stunned processing. When my turn came, I did not rehearse. I spoke from a place I'd already been forced to inhabit by necessity and regret. I explained why I had stayed anonymous, why I had been afraid to take the stage. I told them I had not wanted to rewrite anyone's story, only to keep them safe. I talked about my mother, about receipts and nights of counting bills, about the way fear had become an old friend. I admitted that secrecy had been my mistake. I said the words out loud, each syllable heavy. I was wrong to hide this. Afterwards, in smaller clusters, the reactions were various. Some people thanked me with eyes wet, others looked at me like a stranger. Lila, with her sharp laugh, said quietly, "Next time tell us. We're not fragile." Tom, who had worked on the company's identity for years, put a hand on my shoulder and simply said, "You kept my rent paid." "Thank you." Maya, from accounts, met my gaze and said, "We need structure. We need numbers without theatrics." But not all moments were gentle. Marcus's brother, an investor and a man with a reputation for protecting the company name, approached after the meeting with a legal retort in his eyes. "You've put us at risk," he said, voice flat with accusation. He mentioned terms like fiduciary duty and misrepresentation. The board's calls got louder. The press began to sniff around, an instinctual hunger for drama. At home that night, the city sounded like a distant engine. My hands refused to stop moving. I made coffee I didn't need and sat with it until it went cold. I thought of my mother's face at the hospital, how small and brave she had looked, and I felt like a child who'd hidden a truth until it festered. Then my phone rang. It was my son, Eli, who lived with his father in Ohio now, a teenager who'd folded away any expressions of tenderness in public, but in private still spoke to me with bluntness and love. He was the consequence of a life of choices both regretted and precious. "You okay?" he asked. His voice was cautious, the way someone approaches a sleeping animal. "I'm managing," I said. "It's messy." "Did you have to lie?" he asked. There was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. "I hid things," I said, "for reasons I thought were good. People were hurt. I am sorry." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You always tried to fix stuff, Mom. But sometimes fixing means telling the truth first." His words landed like a lantern in a fog. I sat with that, the heat from the coffee growing tepid, thinking of every moment I had chosen secrecy over transparency. "I know," I said. Legal representatives wrote stern emails. The board considered a vote to require my public resignation as a condition for Marcus's continued leadership. Marcus himself vacillated between outrage and apology, like a man trying to balance the scales of ego and responsibility. Friends advised me to step back. Others said to fight. Every decision felt like choosing between two doors, each with hazards on the other side. In the middle of this, An old wound opened that had nothing to do with business but everything to do with who I believed myself to be. My father's absence was a quiet echo that had driven my decisions, including the one to keep my act of rescue secret. The more power I exercised in secret, the more I resembled the absent man. Unseen, unaccountable, and ultimately unreliable. I found myself in therapy more frequently. My therapist, Dr. Patel, a woman whose office smelled of lemon oil and felt like a safe cove, asked me bluntly, "When did you decide you were the only one who could protect people?" The answer came slow. The night my mother was too tired to count bills, the night my brother and I sat with our backs to each other while the house creaked. "Because no one else would do it," I told Dr. Patel. "Because I was afraid they'd fail." "Or because you were afraid," she said soft, "that failure would be contagious and you'd lose control." It was a hard truth. Control had been a currency and a defense. My secrecy had seemed generous to me, an act of sacrificial protection. But it was, at its core, a refusal to trust others with their own stories. A lawsuit was threatened by an anonymous vendor. The board demanded that Marcus step down from certain discretionary privileges. Employees asked for transparent payroll schedules. Marcus offered an apology on the company page. Carefully worded, 2 paragraphs long, the kind that read well to investors but did not unclench the jaw of someone who'd been publicly humiliated. If you're following this story and it's bringing up something in you, share it. Tell me below. Have you ever been caught between protecting someone and exposing them? I read your stories. They matter. In the weeks that followed, the pressure fractured more than just corporate plans. My brother stopped speaking to me for a month. We texted at odd hours. Short, sharp messages that never evolved into conversation. He accused me of grandstanding. I accused him of cowardice. We traded memories and blows. There were nights I lay awake thinking of our mother, of the 2 of us in that kitchen at 3 in the morning, dividing pocket change. I wondered if my secretive salvation had been a way to rewrite what had once been so clearly written. Survival. The office settled into a new normal with new auditors and a clearer governance structure. Marcus and I were required to attend a mediation with the board to outline future roles. It felt like a divorce in slow motion, contracts and emotions intersecting in legalese and coffee-stained forms. I hated it and learned from it both at once. Mediation was held in a glass-paneled room on a high floor that smelled of lemon cleaning solution and the faint tang of burnt coffee. The skyline outside was a constant, indifferent witness. Marcus and I sat across from a mediator who asked the kind of gentle, precise questions that make people uncomfortable because they require honesty beyond rhetoric. "Why did each of you make the choices you did?" she asked. He spoke about pride and the terror of failure in a room full of people who had once looked at him as a savior. I spoke about my mother and receipts and nights of counting bills until my eyes crossed. We both admitted, in our own ways, that our intentions were tangled with selfishness. I'd wanted to protect people and, perhaps, also to be the one who could. He'd wanted to be the one who could save the world with his pitches, and when that failed he felt small. We agreed on a path forward that was less about blame and more about repair. Lennox would institute a transparent financial oversight committee, one that included representatives from staff, the board, and an independent auditor. Marcus agreed to cede certain unilateral financial powers and to participate in leadership coaching. I agreed to make my involvement explicit. No more blind trusts. The settlement wasn't a clean moral victory for anyone. It was messy and practical and necessary. But the real reconciliation was not the board's acceptance. It was quieter, harder, and more human. Manuel finally called weeks after the town hall. His voice all apologize and stubbornness. We met at a diner in the place where we grew up, the same grease-slicked booths my mother used to wipe down. He looked narrower somehow, a man who'd been through a different battle. "You could have asked me to help," he said between bites of pie. "We grew up together." "I wanted to spare you," I said. The blunt honesty felt like a table set with vulnerable things. "I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting everyone," he admitted softer. "But you forgot to protect yourself. Dad would have told you to stop hiding." We laughed then, A brief laugh that broke into something almost like a sob. Manuel put his hand over mine across the table. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." And in that moment, something felt unlatched. Maybe it was forgiveness, maybe it was exhaustion. Both are messy and sometimes indistinguishable. I began to understand that my mother's diligence was not purely about control. It was about a tender, weary courage that looked like counting coins but felt like hope. At Lennox, the changes began to take root in small human ways. People came to the oversight meetings and asked practical questions. Will payroll be on time? Who approves requisitions? There was no grand parade of gratitude, no cinematic applause. Just the steady business of showing up. We held an open forum where staff could voice concerns, and Marcus read their questions aloud, sometimes with tears. He apologized with words that were not press-managed. It was clumsy and honest. One of the young designers, Carla, told us how she'd had to borrow money to fix a leaky roof and how, for the first time in months, she'd been able to pay the landlord. "You don't have to be a legend," she said to Marcus and me both. "You just have to be fair." Those words lodged in me. Fair. It felt like permission I had sought without knowing it. My relationship with Eli changed in small ways too. He visited one weekend, and we sat in my living room with a pizza box between us and talked about how weird adult things are. He studied my face as if parsing a map. "You taught me to be responsible," he said. "But you taught me that being honest is part of that. I am not trying to tell you this is a neat redemption. It is not. There were lawsuits threatened, a few clients left, and a stain on the company reputation that took months to fade. There were nights when I would wake with my chest tight, my whole body a coil of old anxieties. Sometimes I still caught myself archiving documents with that compulsive tenderness that, I realized, was both protective and prison. What changed most was my relationship to control. I learned to invite others into the work of saving people. I learned that transparency, messy and imperfect as it is, carries a kind of dignity that secrecy never could. I learned that being an investor is not just about money. It is about stewardship, and stewardship cannot exist in the dark. The office no longer went silent the way it had that day. There were still moments of heavy hush when a budget cut was announced, when a beloved staffer left, but the silence had a different quality. It was respectful or sorrowful or full of concentration, not the shocked, accusing silence that once paralyzed us. We learned to speak together. If you've stayed with this story, thank you. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends in future stories. These are not the types of things I talk about often, but I promise there's more. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. If there is a lesson I want to leave you with, it's that intentions do not absolve method. Protecting someone can be love, or it can be a posture of control. The difference is often whether you include them in the protection you offer. We make mistakes. We hurt people while trying to help them. The essential work is to own the hurt, to repair as best we can, and to let those we've sought to protect have agency in their own lives. A year later, Lennox is quieter in a healthy way. We have new processes, and Marcus has become a leader who asks more and decides less. Manuel and I have started a small community fund in our mother's name to help local artists with emergency living expenses. Transparent, committee-driven, audited. It felt right to turn the impulse that once hid behind trust documents into something that sits openly at a kitchen table where anyone can ask, anyone can apply, and everyone can see how the money is used. I still play the piano at night, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 10 minutes, and I count the receipts and tear out the ones that no longer matter. The world is still messy. The relationships are still work. But there is a steadiness now where before there was a precarious, frantic scramble. This story isn't a neat moral. It's a messy, human one, about a woman who chose to save people in secret and found that secrecy wrecked more than it repaired. If anything in this resonates, please consider sharing it. Maybe someone else is sitting in an office that will go silent, and they need a small, trembling example of how to step into the light.